This is Beyond with Heather Tesch, where we examine near-death experiences and life itself, hopefully making this life a little better. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to my guest. Today we have Betty Guadagno. Hello, Betty.
Thanks so much, Heather. So grateful to be here.
Oh, I am so glad to have you here. You had an astonishing transformation after a spiritually transformative experience. I would love for you to take our audience through that, starting with who you were before your experience, lead us through your experience, and then take us into what you're doing today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this space. Whenever I get an opportunity to connect with somebody who creates conscious space, I always just like to take a moment of recognition and gratitude. I think that it's so important for us to create this kind of space to make our extraordinary experiences just ordinary experiences. So many people have them, and it's so great to really keep the conversation going around them. So thank you so much for what you do for the collective. It really is really powerful.
Oh, well, thank you so much for saying that. And thank you for all that you're doing. I always say I would not be here if it weren't for people like you and your incredible stories.
That's beautiful. Okay, so let me get into all the trauma. I will preface it with a trigger warning though, because my life before my experience is very traumatizing. So I'm going to say a lot of triggering things. But the really cool thing about my story is that transformation is possible. And not only is it possible, I think it might be inevitable in most cases. It definitely was in mine.
And Betty, I also want to add that I will pop up a picture of you while you're sharing your story, and people can get an idea.
Oh my goodness. Love the editing skills. That's great. Yeah. So my life before my experience was racked in trauma. Every kind of abuse that you could imagine happening to a young child happened to me. Sexual trauma, physical trauma, emotional, just a whole myriad of abuse. And, that's how my family is. It's been that way for generations and generations. And it's exhausting being the one to break all the generational curses, but that's what I'm doing. And, my parents were drug addicts. They taught me how to use drugs. Their parents taught them how to use drugs. And it's just been that way forever. And my parents were only operating out of their own level of consciousness. I don't have any sort of resentment or blame or guilt or shame towards anything that happened in my family, because it's made me the person that I am today. And it's led me to my spiritual experiences, and it's led me to source. So today I have a really great grasp on breaking that victim mentality, because for all of my life, I just thought, why me, poor me. And today I recognize that I'm a conscious creator of my experience. And in 2007, I experienced a very traumatic loss. My parents, who were both really active in their own addiction to substances, made a decision that they had to end their suffering. They had to stop using drugs. And the only way that they knew how to do that was to do what they saw other people in our family do, and that was to die. And so in 2007, my parents intentionally overdosed. They committed suicide together. And that death obviously completely rocked my world. I was 23 when that happened, and my sister was 18, and we found them. And they left these really brief notes that really didn't explain much. But I understood the mindset because I had already dealt with those kinds of thoughts in my own life, wanting to leave Earth, wanting to kill myself. The pain, the physical pain of addiction, the pain of poverty. We were really very poor, and that it's just so overwhelming. And, they just didn't know that there was any other way to live. They didn't even know that you could just stop using drugs and just start to live a different life. They really thought that this was their only option. So, in that moment of my parents' suicide, my addiction really became my parent, and my addiction rocked with me all the way till the end. It even branded me. I'm covered in tattoos of liquor bottles and packs of cigarettes. Like, this was my whole identity. And I was very much living in my shadow. Today, I have some language for it. I was a ruthless, domineering, abusive person. I was a traumatized person who was traumatizing other people. So, in 2019, I had this really transformative spiritual experience that was onset by a drug overdose where I got so high that I met God. That's what it felt like anyway. And God had one message for me, and that message was, girl, you got to stop using drugs. And I was like, what? That's crazy. So I wrote my whole experience off as drug-induced psychosis because I was a militant atheist before my experience. And again, I had taken a bunch of drugs, so I just thought that I was really, like in it hard. And it wasn't until the signs and synchronicities and the healings that came later that I realized that my experience was a true one. But some of the main parts of my experience that I think are really important to share about. Number one, when I entered the space of eternity, I was an atheist. I was a drug addict. I was a prostitute. I was a liar, a manipulator, a thief. I was a racist. I was a rapist. I was all of the things that you would think would condemn you to some other kind of experience. And there I was, completely unconditionally loved by source energy. And so one of the main things that I took away from my experience is that there is no such thing as condemnation. Condemnation is just what I put myself through. So in my experience, I had what I can perceive as a life review. So I experienced things in my life, not only from my perspective, but from the other person's perspective, and not just from my life. So a big part of my experience was this life review where I not only experienced my own life from both ends, from my point of view and the other person's point of view, but I also experienced my family members' experiences. So I had an aunt who, my cousin died when I was 16, and I felt the pain of the mother losing her child. I felt my aunt's experience, and it was so insanely devastating. I mean, I have so much respect for people who lose children on earth. I mean, the pain that I felt experiencing it in this life review was so tremendous. It was the worst agony. And then I also felt my parents' suicide, not only from my perspective as a grieving daughter, but also from their perspective. And that pain was like an ocean of cement. It was like strangling. It was like every cell in my body was covered in static and spikes and getting cut open and ripped apart. It was so painful. And then I started to hear these masculine voices guiding me into the light. And the first voice that greeted me was my divine masculine energy, my twin flame energy. And then it kind of morphed into every masculine energy that I've ever known in my life. So my father was there to greet me. And he just kept affirming, you are worthy of all the love in the universe. You are worthy of all the love in the universe. And so I was following his voice, and I landed on what looked like a spaceship. And a lot of my experience, it kind of centers around the simulation theory, because everything kind of looked like a video game, and it was very futuristic looking. Everything was actually just blank white light, but these were all the images that were coming into my perception, into my mind's eye. And I was on the deck of the spaceship. I came out of the side of one of the walls. I was surrounded by thousands of other souls, and we were all getting ready for our mission to jump to Earth. And that I was downloaded with the mission, and it was the Great Awakening. And they explained that we were spiritual soldiers sent on a mission to uplift the consciousness of the planet from a level of third dimensional thinking to fifth dimensional thinking. And we would be picking our lives. And there was a commander in the center who was gearing us up for our trip. And it was just this bright white light. And you can call that light Christ light or Krishna, Buddha, source, whatever higher entity resonates with you, because it's all the same thing. And it was incredible. And everybody was so excited, all of these light bodies all standing around each other. And then my awareness shifted to another scene where I was in front of a table of beings. They were most certainly people in charge, and they were about to take me through the details of my pre-birth plan. So they were telling me that I had actually chosen the life that I had just left, and that I was a divine co-creator of my experience. And so they took me through this grocery store that had all the grocery aisles were lined with these big cereal boxes, and every cereal box had a life experience on it. And I had this empty grocery cart, and I just start grabbing all the boxes because I knew that I was coming to earth for this divine mission. And so I needed to transmute a lot of negative energy. And because of the family line that I chose to be born into, I was already predisposed to have many experiences. So childhood sexual trauma, poverty, addiction, dereliction, degradation, homelessness was part of my life experience as well. And then there were things in the cart that I hadn't gotten to yet in my life, like recovery and overcoming and spiritual awakening and being an author. But none of those things had happened in my life, so they didn't resonate. And one of the really important parts of the scene of the pre-birth plan is that when I picked the cereal box of the childhood sexual trauma, a little orb of light came out with the box. And that orb of light was the soul of the man who would molest me as a small child. And we came into contract with each other. We decided together that we would play these roles for each other. And I saw all the reasons why. And one of the main reasons was that in a previous life, I had been his abuser in this capacity. And so we were balancing the lives with each other. And also, like I shared, for the collective itself. So as I heal my own sexual trauma, I'm not only healing for myself, I'm healing for every little girl who maybe didn't get an opportunity to do that before they left Earth. Or, I'm healing it for future generations in my own family line and people that I can't see or touch or perceive or anything. So, in the moment of being downloaded with the pre-birth plan, it was like instant transformation, 180 degrees. Victim mentality completely broke off of me. I was a sovereign being who had predetermined my own life. I wasn't a victim to my circumstance. And I went back into the table, in front of the table of beings, and I thanked them. And I was so full of gratitude. I was so grateful to have this information. And I told them, I'm not going back to Earth, but I am so grateful to know all of this because it's so cool. And they were like, oh, no, you're definitely going back. You're not meant to stay here. You're only here for this information. And I was kicking and screaming like a small child. And I said, you guys don't tell us what Earth is actually like. And there's no way I'm going back. You'll never make me go back. And they were just kind of like, it seemed very humorous. Like, oh yeah, you've said this before. We've heard this many times before. We get it. When you're there, you don't like it. And then when you come back, you want to go straight back. And I really did not want to go back. Because, the life that I was living was so chaotic. It was so painful. Just to be me every day was so painful. And they told me that if I didn't go back into the body that I just came from, that I would be reborn into a baby to complete the mission. And this wasn't a punishment. It wasn't like, we're making you go back. It was simply, you signed up for something. You're here for the transformation of consciousness. It's the most exciting time to be on Earth. You wanted to be a part of it. We're not going to let you miss your opportunity. So you'll go back in a baby and you'll have the opportunity to transmute all of the energy that you wanted to. And so then they showed me the baby and everything about her. And she was going to take on my life experience cart. So she's going to have to do it all over again, starting from zero. And then she had even deeper levels of societal adversity because of the family that she was being born into. And I just thought, oh man, if these are really my only options, starting from zero or going back into that glitched, unhealed body that I just came from, I guess I'll go back into her. And then I felt my awareness sifting back into my body. And I remember them very clearly saying, the first part of your life was boot camp. And the second part of your life will be carrying out the mission. And you're going to have kindred spirits and soulmates and mentors and teachers and community. And it's not going to be nearly as challenging as the first part of your life. Trust us. And I just remember looking back and saying, I do not trust you guys. And then I found myself back in my body.
Betty, it's such an incredible story, but it really doesn't end there because you still had this addiction when you came back. So step us through that. And then once you're done, I've got so many questions regarding what you've already told us.
Definitely. Yeah. Again, because I thought that my experience was drug-induced psychosis, I just went back to living my life the way that I had been because nothing had changed. I just had some really weird adventure that I thought was just a figment of my imagination. And then the universe stepped in, my higher power stepped in this really loud, tangible way to guide me onto a different path because I wasn't going there willingly. And so my world got very, very small. And being a drug addict seemed like it was no longer an option because all of my drug dealers decided to stop selling drugs on the exact same day. Like I had 10 different dealers. I called up each one of them and every single one of them had almost an identical story. Something like, hey, I'm out of the game. I found Jesus. I want to be a good dad. Don't call me anymore. And every single one of them said this, but these guys didn't know each other. And so it was so bizarre. And I knew that something was blocking me and I'd never experienced this before. And so then I had no way to get what I needed. And I had a physical dependency to heroin. So I was really terrified of going through physical withdrawal because it's very painful. And I had done it many times in my life, but every time you go through it, it's just the absolute worst agony. And I was on day 3 of withdrawal, which is the absolute worst day. And it felt like my bones were made of fire and my skin was made of broken glass and hot and cold sweats and sick from both ends and just welcoming death. And having a deep moment of mental or spiritual suicide where I knew exactly what my parents had gone through. And I thought, I'm going to have to do the same thing to make this pain stop. And that right then I heard a voice and it told me that I could request what I wanted fixed. And I was in the throes of desperation. So I was like, okay, strange voice, fix me. I don't want to be going through withdrawal. And they told me to lay back and count backwards from 10. And as I did, I saw these 2 little men appear in my mind's eye. And every time I tell the story, I can see them again. And they just wave at me like, yeah, we're still here. They were wearing these white lab coats and they had these bulbous noses. And then these little lawnmowers manifested in front of them. And I watched these 2 men walk through the crevices of my mind. And as they walked through with these lawnmowers, I felt these intense hot tingles. And I just knew that something magical was happening. And in hindsight, I truly believe that they were paving out new neural pathways for me. And as they finished mapping out my mind, at the end, I felt somebody draw X's across my forehead. And then there was this plunger on the crown of my head. And in this bright white flash, I was instantaneously healed out of day 3 of heroin withdrawal. I mean, moments before I was sick all over myself, welcoming death. And then there I was completely well and healed and fine. And I threw myself on the floor and I was crying out to the Creator. How could this be happening to me? I don't believe in this. I don't believe in you. You could not have picked a more unworthy subject to bestow this kind of grace on. And after that experience, my life, my path became nearly crystal clear. At first, I thought that I was the second coming of Christ. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. I have the power and the ability to heal other people. And I went out on the New York City subway system and I was proselytizing and evangelizing and I was laying hands on homeless drug addicts, trying to heal them. It was crazy and chaotic because, mind you, I was also a homeless drug addict. So it was just totally insane. And then as the dust started to settle and my integration started to take place, I found myself on one of those trains. I was completely alone in the train car, which is bizarre in New York City. And the subway doors opened and a man stepped in and he sat directly across from me, even though the whole train car was empty. And around his neck were the letters of the 12-step fellowship that I now belong to. He was wearing a pendant. And I heard this voice in my head and it said, that's your path. Follow him to a 12-step meeting. And that was the day that I really stopped using drugs. And I went to a meeting and I followed him. And I went to another meeting the next day and I looked messed up when I came into this process. I was missing most of my teeth. Thank you, recovery, for letting me buy some teeth in my life. I was super skinny and gray and sunken in. My eyes were dead. I had picked these huge holes like in my face and all over my arms because I thought that bugs lived inside my skin. And so I would cut myself open with razor blades and I would burn myself with torches trying to get the bugs out of me. And so I looked destroyed when I started going to these meetings or when I started on this path. And I walked into this women's meeting and they could see how messed up I was. And as soon as I walked in, this one woman grabbed me and she hugged me so tight. And she whispered in my ear and she said, "You are worthy of all the love in the universe. You are worthy of all the love in the universe." And it was the same message that my father told me in my spiritual experience to guide me into the light. And I melted into that woman and I rested my head on her big boobies for as long as she would let me. And I cried into her. And that was my deepest moment of spiritual surrender. In that moment, I truly gave up, that I didn't know what was for my highest good. I didn't know what had happened to me. I had no language for my experience. I just thought that I had died and I was just trying to get back to heaven. And so I thought that God wanted me to do recovery to get back to heaven. So I found myself in a long-term rehab and I kept crying out to God and I'd be like, "Okay, God, I haven't used drugs in 14 days. Are you coming to get me? When do I get to come back home?" And then I'd reach another milestone. "Okay, God, it's been 2 months. Please come pick me up." And I just thought that I was trying to get back to the spiritual experience, get back to heaven. And as I integrated my experience more and more, and I started to shift and create my reality with new thoughts, I realized that it's not about going back to heaven. It's about bringing heaven here. And so every day I make a conscious decision to bring heaven to my earthly experience. And I really get to do that when I connect with other people. And it really does feel like the same vibration of heaven when I get to connect with others. And so I'm so grateful that I'm part of so many different spiritual communities today.
And you have had such an incredible transformation and you are benefiting people in those communities now that you're taking part in. One thing about your experience that I know some people are thinking is they're going to say, well, that doesn't sound like the heaven I heard about. And the comfort, sometimes people enjoy listening to near-death experiences until it gets out of their comfort zone. So when you describe like the spaceship and the grocery store, were these things more tailored for you, or is everybody going to have that exact same experience?
Yeah, I think that there is some individuality to a spiritual experience. It's obviously going through the lens of my own perception. It's going to come to me in a way that I won't be too scared of. So, for instance, my father greeted me. Now, if it was some strange man, I might not have been so apt to follow the voice, but because I recognized the energy and I felt the voice of my father, I was like, "Oh, I know that person. I'll go towards that." So I do think that it is individual in some way for everybody. I think the underlying mirrored experience in most of these spiritual experiences is the idea of unconditional love and oneness. And, my experience could be because of the generation that I'm born in, or it could be because we're living in a simulation. You can take your pick. But that just is a system of thought and a lens of perception that helps me with my human experience. So it might not resonate for somebody else. And that's totally okay, because there's so many different experiences for people to find what works for them.
Well, Betty, I've got some questions that a lot of viewers have put in my comment section. So I want to ask you that coming up in part 2. For those of you that are listening, you'll want to stick around for that, because I do think you're going to want to hear some of the things that I'll be asking Betty. And for those of you that made it all the way to the end of this video, I just want to say thank you so much. And just if you want to type in the comments, "made it," and just hit a little comment, I'll make sure to respond to you. And Betty, thank you again. I will connect with you in the next episode. Thanks so much for joining me on Beyond with Heather Tesch. That was part 1. Make sure to listen to part 2. And if you liked what you heard, please hit the thumbs up button and subscribe for more episodes.